This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
How's everybody doing? Good. First of all, once again, on behalf of the National Park Service, let me welcome you to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name's Ranger Carlton Smith, and I'll be with you this afternoon talking about Old Buck. And this is the life and times of Franklin Buchanan, a longtime U.S. Naval officer who later became the only full admiral in the Confederate Navy. Now, Raphael Sims was promoted to Rear Admiral, but Buchanan's the only full admiral in the Confederate Navy. And we should probably get the name settled right here at the beginning. Notice if you're from the North, you would pronounce this as Franklin Buchanan. And this seems to be a regional thing. North of the Mason-Dixon line, it is Buchanan, as in President James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. South of the Mason-Dixon line, it's Buchanan, as in Franklin Buchanan and Buchanan, West Virginia. As some of my West Virginia friends in college reminded everybody. So it is going to be Buchanan, and that's the title, Old Buck. But I do slip up sometimes, so I apologize in advance if I do. But Franklin Buchanan was born near Baltimore on September 17, 1800. He's the nephew of Thomas McKean, a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Delaware. He'll be appointed a midshipman in 1815 at the age of 15 to serve in the USS Java in the Mediterranean. In 1817, he's going to be transferred to the ship of the line USS Franklin, also in the Mediterranean. And while on the Franklin, he'll meet another midshipman from Delaware, Samuel Francis DuPont. And DuPont and Buchanan find they have a lot in common. Among other things, they are intensely ambitious in their naval careers, and they are both intolerant of mediocrity. So those are some of the things they have in common, and they remain friends for almost 40 years. Also serving with them was another 16-year-old midshipman named David Glasgow Farragut. And Farragut and Buchanan will meet several years later under less than friendly circumstances. But Buchanan, in 1823, Buchanan is part of what's called the Mosquito Fleet, which is basically trying to chase down pirates in the Caribbean. And like most of the fleet, Buchanan never really encountered any pirates. They couldn't find them. He's finally promoted to lieutenant in January of 1825. He's named as first lieutenant on the USS Constellation, manning 36 guns with a crew of 340 men. As the first lieutenant, Buchanan is essentially the second in command. He's responsible for attending the watching, quartering, berthing, station, and numbering of the ship's company. He superintends the duty of the ship and keeps the ship in order for any contingency. The first lieutenant today is still second in command for small naval ships, including frigates and destroyers. It also means the first lieutenant is responsible for discipline on the ship. In his career, Buchanan is going to be known for some liberal ideas. He's in favor, for example, of a naval academy. He likes the idea of steam-driven ships when steam becomes available. But he's not his ideas on discipline are not going to change. And he is an advocate of the use of flogging to maintain discipline among the enlisted men. So you can imagine he's not very popular among most of the crews he's going to be serving with. And he has a very low tolerance for self-indulgence, including laziness and drunkenness. And of course, sailors back then haven't changed too much from sailors today, if you ever known any sailors who go on shore leave. He is going to be assigned as first lieutenant to the USS Delaware, which is a ship of the line mounting 74 guns and a crew of 820 men in the Mediterranean. He was served shortly as first lieutenant on the USS United States, a frigate with 44 guns and 467 men. In May of 1826, Buchanan is going to meet Anne Catherine Lloyd, and they're going to become married. Now, this was not a short engagement by any means. They met in 1826. They would not get married until February of 1835, almost 9 years later. So they're going to take their time in getting married. But by marrying Anne Catherine Lloyd, Buchanan now comes into the extended Lloyd family of Maryland. And that also means he's going to adopt most of their political and social values. Now, the Lloyd family owned most of Talbot County, Maryland, and they were tobacco planters, which means, among other things, they owned a lot of slaves to maintain all the plantations. And it was said that they had more in common with planters further south than with the people of Talbot County or Maryland in general. To give you an idea of the prominence of the Lloyd family, Edward Lloyd IV, Nanny's father, was the former governor of Maryland. And the Lloyd estate is the same estate associated with the life of Frederick Douglass when he was a slave. The family estate was known as White House, and it's still there. And it was said that if you visited White House, was almost constantly filled with company who would entertain with an ease and an elegance to be met with few houses in Maryland. In 1839, Buchanan was served as the flag lieutenant on the staff of Commodore Alexander Claxton. Now, Claxton will establish his flagship on the USS Constitution in the Pacific. But keep in mind, Claxton is the squadron commander, and the flag lieutenant is his chief aide. You can almost think of that as the Navy equivalent of the Army aide-de-camp. So Buchanan would do basically whatever Claxton wants him to do. But the Constitution is simply the flagship. The Constitution itself has its own captain and first lieutenant, and they're the ones responsible for operating the ship. So Buchanan has nothing to do with discipline while he's serving as flag lieutenant. And as a result of that, he becomes very friendly with the crew because he's much more relaxed about it. He doesn't have to care about discipline. So he's out there talking with the crew, getting to know them, kind of swapping sea stories with them. And once or twice when one of them went over the side of the ship, Buchanan was usually the first one in the boats to go to rescue them. So this was a unique experience. This was probably the only crew that really liked Franklin Buchanan as an officer. He also had one distinction serving on the Constitution, and that is this was the only time Franklin Buchanan served with his brother, McKean Buchanan, who was a paymaster in the United States Navy. Edward Lloyd V, who is Nanny Buchanan's brother, is going to purchase a house for the Buchanans in Talbot County in 1841 called the Rest. And that will be their home for the rest of their lives. In 1841, Buchanan is promoted to commander and assigned to command the USS Vincennes, 18 guns with 125 men in the Gulf of Mexico. In 1845, he's appointed the first superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. Now, as the first superintendent, among other things, he has to develop a curriculum. What are these young midshipmen going to study at the academy that they're not going to study on board a ship? So among other things, these are future naval officers. So they are going to have to learn about seamanship, navigation, and steam engineering while they're at the academy. But Buchanan also has to hire the faculty to teach these subjects. And he has to make modifications to Old Fort Severn at Annapolis, which had been given to the Navy by the Army to start the school. And he has to do all of this in a period of about 2 months, because the first class is coming in October of 1845. And Buchanan would do an excellent job of getting the Naval Academy started and off on the right foot. He's then assigned command of the USS Germantown with 20 guns and 210 men operating off of Veracruz, Mexico in the Mexican War. The squadron commander is going to be Matthew C. Perry. And on April 18, 1847, Buchanan will lead an assault on the Mexican fort of Tuxpan and capture it. In 1851, he's given a very plum assignment. He's given command of the USS Susquehanna, one of the newest and best ships in the U.S. Navy. And this is actually a sidewheel steamer numbering 300 men and assigned to the Far East Squadron. The squadron is under the command of Commodore Matthew C. Perry, and he will now receive orders to take a squadron and negotiate a deal to open Japan to Western trade. Now, the Commodore and most Americans already knew that you did not negotiate with the Emperor directly. You negotiate with emissaries sent out by the Emperor. So Commodore Perry decided the two can play that game. And he decides to sit in his cabin and sends Buchanan out to negotiate with the Japanese. And then when a personal representative from the Emperor shows up, that's when Commodore Perry will leave his cabin. And when he does leave his cabin, he's going to leave it in full dress uniform with epaulets, the cocked hat, the sword. He'll have a Marine Guard. The sailors will roam ashore in their dress uniforms, and he's going to be carried around on shore in a sedan chair. So he's going to try to remain as mysterious as the Emperor. So Buchanan is the one doing the real negotiation under the control of Commodore Perry. And he does a very good diplomatic job. Among other things, Buchanan would be the first American to land in Tokyo Bay. And the negotiations, of course, are very successful, and Japan will agree to open its ports to Western trade. In 1859, Buchanan gets another plum assignment when he's named commanding officer of the Washington Navy Yard. In that capacity, on May 15th of 1860, he's going to welcome the first Japanese mission to the United States. But of course, war clouds are now coming into the nation. And on January 8, 1861, Captain Buchanan notified Commander John Dahlgren, the ordnance officer at the Navy Yard, with this message. Various rumors are in circulation that a mob will attempt to possess themselves of this yard between this and the 4th of March next, for the purpose of securing the arms and ammunition now in the armory and magazine, to be used in preventing the inauguration of Mr. Lincoln, the President-elect. You are therefore prepared for the defense of the yard, all the howitzers now available in the Ordnance Department, with as much secrecy as possible. This yard shall not be surrendered to any person or persons except by an order from the Honorable Secretary of the Navy. And in the event of an attack, I shall require all officers and others under my command to defend it to the last extremity. And should we be overpowered by numbers, the armory and magazines must be blown up. Isaac Torrey, who was still Secretary of the Navy, wrote to Captain Buchanan on February 7th, Buchanan wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, Isaac Torrey, should I receive information from reliable persons in whom I can place confidence, and who have promised to inform me of any contemplated movement to seize the yard, I will at once assemble all employees of the yard and promulgate my orders, and have extra sentinels posted and a lieutenant stationed at night with a gun's crew in the ordnance building, probably with the design, if nothing else, of blowing that up if he has to. President Lincoln, of course, will be inaugurated on March 4th, very peaceful, but the Navy Yard is ready, and the Army had sentinels placed all over the city to make sure of a peaceful transfer of power. On April 3rd of 1861, one of Buchanan's daughters, Nanny, marries Lieutenant Julius E. Marie of the U.S. Marine Corps at the Washington Navy Yard. The guest list included President Lincoln. Now, the Lloyd family probably did not expect Lincoln to show up, and they weren't going to be too happy if he did, because they already did not agree with some of Lincoln's policies. In fact, one daughter, Elizabeth, declared she would not shake Lincoln's hand. The president does show up. He's a little late and misses the wedding itself. Buchanan is professionally correct in his dealings with the president, but it said that Lincoln's cheerful demeanor and friendly manner convinced Elizabeth to shake his hand. And the president will escort the bride into the bridal dinner later that afternoon. So far, Buchanan is doing his part as a loyal naval officer. So what changes? Well, among other things, 9 days after the wedding, the Confederacy will open fire on Fort Sumter. The real kick is going to come on April 19th, 1861. That's the date when the 6th Massachusetts was marching through Baltimore from one train station to the next, and a riot breaks out. Several soldiers and civilians are going to be killed or injured. Buchanan now becomes convinced that his home state of Maryland is going to secede. So on April 22nd, there's a number of orders and dispatches going back and forth from the new Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, and the people of the Naval Yard. At first, Wells gets in touch with Buchanan and orders him to prepare 4 captured steamers and get them ready for war service. And Buchanan would transmit those orders to John Dahlgren. In fact, Dahlgren wrote to Commander Dahlgren and told him this on the same day, April 22nd. As I have this day resigned my commission as a captain in the Navy, and consider myself only temporarily in command here, you are carrying out all the instructions you have received in preparing the steamers for war service, as directed by my order to you this morning, and superintend the defense of the yard when necessary. I shall not take any part in the defense of this yard from this date. So because of the events of April 19th, and because Buchanan thought Maryland was going to secede from the Union, he tendered his resignation to Secretary Wills as a naval officer and turned everything over to Commander Dahlgren. Dahlgren also on April 22nd wrote to the Secretary, in the absence of the Commandant of the Yard, I have to report to you that I have prepared the steamer Mount Vernon for service to receive your orders. As soon as I learn that the resignation of Captain Buchanan has taken place, I shall lose no time in putting the yard into the best state of defense that time and means permit. By early May, it was obvious that the state of Maryland was not going to succeed. Now, Buchanan could at times be kind of impetuous. And some people feel this is one of those times he was too impetuous in his decision. In fact, Buchanan must have realized it as well, because he wrote to Secretary Wills basically asking to withdraw his resignation. But there apparently were some conditions on that. And among them, Buchanan was asking to be assigned to the West Coast or to some station where he might not have to engage with Confederate forces. And you can imagine the Secretary's reaction to that. The nation's at war. And here's one of his senior captains trying to find a way out of having to fight the Confederates. The upshot of this is Buchanan does receive a response back from Wills, but it's not the one he was expecting. Wills actually refused to accept Buchanan's resignation. Instead, Buchanan was dismissed from the naval service, basically fired. And that was his reward for 40 years of service, and that's the way he looked at it. But this was not necessarily unusual by Secretary Wills. Between April 18th and May 23rd, 1861, 11 officers assigned to the Norfolk Navy Yard had submitted their resignations, and all of them are going to be dismissed. As far as Secretary Wills was concerned, if you could not stand by the flag, you were not worthy of a commission. So he denied some of these guys the honor of resigning and dismissed them as unworthy. Of the 93 captains on the Navy list, 9 resigned and those resignations were accepted. 6 were actually dismissed from the naval service. And Secretary Wills also kept in mind that his predecessor, Isaac Torcy, had been censured by the House of Representatives for his general treatment of resignations. And seems that most resignations had been accepted until the firing on Fort Sumter. Once war actually broke out, Wills was not accepting those resignations. And this stands in contrast to other Southern officers like David Glasgow Farragut. Now, Buchanan, because his appointment as a midshipman occurred when his family was living in Philadelphia, he's officially on the Navy rolls as coming from Pennsylvania. So technically, as far as the Navy was concerned, he was a Northerner. Farragut is officially from the state of Tennessee. But Farragut felt he had served the United States collectively and not individually. And that was a view more prevalent in the Navy than it was in the Army. Of the 1,554 officers on the Navy list, 253 were Southern born. Of that number, 126 resigned or were dismissed. A majority of the Southern born, and admittedly it was a bare majority, stayed in the U.S. Navy. Buchanan wrote a letter to his longtime friend, Captain Samuel DuPont. Remember, they had been friends for about 40 years. And Buchanan tried to explain why he had left the Navy. And in part, this is what he said. I am now so thoroughly and completely disgusted with the present administration and the vile party which is governing the country, that nothing now, my worthy friend, could induce me to accept my former situation in the Navy. Good God, DuPont, can this government last under such rulers? My worthy friend, that flag, which I have served under faithfully many years and had hoped to die under, no longer exists. It has been degraded, disgraced, and torn to pieces by those who rule the country. And then he adds, it is no reason why we should not remain as warm friends. Now keep in mind, he's writing this letter to an officer, a fellow officer, who has declared his allegiance to the United States Navy. So what do you think DuPont's reaction is going to be to this? Well, his reaction was not to respond to Buchanan's letter, ever. As far as DuPont goes, this ended their friendship. And he never wrote to Buchanan again, even after the war was over. So that's always what DuPont thought. On September 4th, 1861, Buchanan's going to report to Richmond, where he's made a captain in the Confederate States Navy and placed in charge of the Bureau of Orders and Details. This position gives him authority over all personnel questions, including recruiting enlisted men, assigning officers to duty, determining ranks and promotion, and courts-martial. So it's a very important position, especially in this brand new Navy. The Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, knew that the South would never be able to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship, and therefore the South's going to have to improvise. One of the decisions made is to raise the remains of the USS Merrimack, which had been scuttled with the Norfolk Navy Yard, was surrendered. Raise the remains, cut it down to the berth deck, and then put a case-minute ironclad over top of it and rechristen it the CSS Virginia. On February 24th, 1862, Captain Franklin Buchanan is ordered to assume command of the James River Squadron. And Secretary Mallory wrote, "You will hoist your flag on the Virginia. The Virginia is a novelty in naval construction. It is untried and her powers unknown. And the department will not give specific orders as to her attack upon the enemy. Her powers as a ram are regarded as very formidable, and it is hoped that you may be able to test them." And on March 8th, 1862, that's exactly what Buchanan's going to do. He steams the Virginia into Hampton Roads to try to break the Federal blockade. He is going to steam past the USS Congress, a wooden sailing ship, because he's after a bigger target. The Congress fires a full broadside at the Virginia as he passes within 300 yards to absolutely no effect. The shots are just bouncing off the sides of the ironclad. The Virginia in return fires hot shot into the Congress and starts to set it on fire. Now, if you want to know what this distance is, 300 yards, it's roughly 300 yards from the angle to the Emmitsburg Road. So that'll give you a sense of distance of these two ships, at least at that time. Buchanan now steers the Virginia towards USS Cumberland, another wooden sailing ship. And despite the fire from the Cumberland, the Virginia, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, strikes the Cumberland on the forward starboard side with enough force to drive straight into the Cumberland. Now, when you're ramming another ship, you just want to ram it enough to cave on the side and put a hole in it. That's it. You don't want to drive all the way into the middle of the ship. But that's what the Virginia did. It drove in so far, it got stuck. And with the Cumberland going down, there's every reason the ship's going to take the Virginia with it. But they managed to get the Virginia out. But in doing so, they break off the ram itself. So now you've got a ramming ship with no ram. It's been broken off. With the Cumberland now going down, Buchanan returns attention back to the USS Congress. And he starts to attack the Congress about 3:55 in the afternoon. The Congress itself attempted to get closer to the guns, the Union guns of Newport News, but runs aground. The Virginia is now able to rake the ship fore and aft at a range of 150 yards. The Congress will also be attacked by 2 of the Virginia's escort ships. The only means of defense are the stern guns, and they are quickly disabled. The commanding officer of the Congress is killed about 4:20 p.m. The ship is already burning in several places. The wounded and dying are pounding up, and the colors are finally hauled down at about 4:45 p.m., meaning the ship is surrendered. The garrison, the federal garrison at Newport News, however, is going to continue to fire, with the Confederates trying to board the Congress. Now, whether or not Captain Buchanan knew this, and he probably didn't, his brother McKean Buchanan was serving as paymaster on USS Congress. He is going to survive the action and die in service in 1871. On shore, Brigadier General Joseph K.F. Mansfield is in command of Union troops at Newport News. And he reported as soon as he saw the action going on, I ordered Colonel Brown of the 20th Indiana Regiment, then close at hand, to send 2 rifle companies to the beach. The 2 rifled guns under Captain Howard and a rifled Dahlgren howitzer, manned by 14 sailors of the Cumberland, went into action from a raking position on the beach covered by sandbanks and trees against these steamers. So that's who's opening fire on the steamers. But it was pointed out to the general that the Congress had surrendered. And the general's response to that statement was, I know the damn ship has surrendered, but we haven't. And so Mansfield's going to continue to fire. Buchanan is incensed at what he sees as a breach of naval etiquette. Once the ship surrenders, you're supposed to stop fighting. So he takes a rifled musket, goes up on top of the casement of the Virginia, and starts to open fire. And he is hit in the left thigh, a mini ball having passed entirely through the fleshy portion, grazing the femoral artery, and inflicting a serious wound. So Buchanan is now out of action. But Buchanan is going to order more hotshot fired into the Congress. And the fires will finally hit the magazines around midnight and blow up the ship. But Franklin Buchanan has now inflicted the worst defeat in U.S. naval history until December 7th, 1941. he has sunk 2 ships at a cost of about 300 killed or wounded on the Federal side. But keep in mind the 2 ships he sank were wooden sailing ships. They weren't steamships. And that fact's going to play a part a little bit later. But it also means because of his wound, he misses the action the next day, March 9th, between the Virginia and the USS Monitor. So he misses that historic engagement altogether. On August 26, 1862, Franklin Buchanan is promoted to full admiral for gallant and meritorious conduct in attacking the enemy's fleet in Hampton Roads and destroying the frigate Congress, sloop of war Cumberland, and 3 small steamers, whilst in command of the squadron in the waters of Virginia. He is next ordered to Mobile Bay to take command of the naval squadron in the naval district of the Gulf. By that point, Mobile is the only Gulfport city still connected to the interior. It's also the last major port on the Gulf of Mexico for Confederate blockade runners. There is a strong Union blockade at the mouth of the bay. Now, you kind of have to picture Mobile Bay. And you've got the entrance down here guarded by Fort Morgan. And then it's a pretty extensive bay until you get to the north where the city of Mobile is. So U.S. naval strategy is not necessarily to capture Mobile City. It's to close the bay. Once you've closed the bay, blockade runners can't get in. But guarding the entrance to the bay is Fort Morgan. And so this is a case where the Navy can't take Mobile Bay without the assistance of the Army. Okay? Now, Rear Admiral David Farragut had wanted to attack Mobile Bay ever since he captured the city of New Orleans in April of 1862. But the Navy had other priorities, and he was always lacking Army cooperation for a move on Mobile. But by the summer of 1864, the situation has changed. And now he has permission from the Navy Department to go after Mobile, and he finally has Army cooperation to try to capture the bay. For Buchanan, there are 4 ironclads being constructed for the defense of Mobile Bay. Only one, the CSS Tennessee, is going to be completed in time to defend the harbor. But Buchanan wrote to his brother-in-law, Edward Lloyd, in December of 1862. And keep in mind, this is before the fall of Vicksburg or anything else. And Buchanan is saying, when we thrash the vile vagabonds in Mississippi and here, I think they will be tired of trying to subjugate us. Fight to the death is now the universal feeling. My preparations to meet them here are still progressing. And if they give us a little more time to complete them, they may come on and we will receive them joyfully. Rear Admiral Farragut would take his fleet into Mobile Bay on August 5th of 1864. By 6 a.m., Farragut's squadron was moving on a northerly course. At 6 or 8, they crossed the bar from the Gulf into the bay itself. The USS Tecumseh and Manhattan, 2 of Farragut's 4 ironclads, opened fire at Fort Morgan at 6:47 a.m. at long range. Fort Morgan opened up on the USS Brooklyn at a range of about a half a mile. And again, keep in mind the distance from the angle to the Virginia Memorial is about 1 mile. So there's the distance from, so half of that is the distance from Fort Morgan to the Brooklyn, if you're looking for some comparison of distance. The fleet is going to be exposed to fire from Fort Morgan and a raking fire from Buchanan's Naval Squadron. At that point, Farragut can only use his chase guns, the guns on the very bows of the ship. So he opened fire with a 100-pounder Parrott when opposite the fort, fired all 12 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbores from the starboard side. The Tennessee comes out to try to ram the Hartford, Farragut's flagship, but the Hartford manages to avoid it. The Tennessee then unsuccessfully attacked other Federal ships before seeking shelter under the guns of Fort Morgan. The USS Hartford and the Federal fleet managed to get past Fort Morgan, get into the bay itself, and anchor about 4 miles northwest of Fort Morgan by 8:35 a.m. So roughly 2.5 hours after they entered the bay, they've now, in a sense, captured Mobile Bay. And Farragut is standing on the bridge of the Hartford, talking to the Hartford's commander, Captain Percival Dryden, who also happens to be Farragut's fleet captain, or chief of staff. And Farragut's turning to a junior officer and telling him, "You may pass through a long career and see many in action without seeing the bloodshed you have this day witnessed." Captain Dryden then spoke up and said, "What we have done has been well done, sir, but it all counts for nothing so long as the Tennessee is there under the guns of Fort Morgan." And they were not expecting the Tennessee to come out. They fully thought the Tennessee would stay under the guns of Fort Morgan for protection. So Farragut is explaining to Dryden that he plans to go in after nightfall with 3 ironclads, himself on the USS Manhattan leading the attack to take care of the Tennessee. So it's going to be a night attack. When suddenly the Tennessee itself is seen to be coming out, and Dryden calls the crew to quarters at 8:45. Now, why Buchanan is coming out is anybody's guess. He's under the guns of Fort Morgan, he's well protected, but for some reason he must have felt because he had an ironclad, he could take on Farragut's fleet. And that's exactly what he's proposing to do. Farragut himself is going to be in the port mizzen rigging above the poop deck. And at one point, the Hartford and the Tennessee are running towards each other bow on, almost the Navy equivalent of chicken. And it's going to be Buchanan and the Tennessee who fronts first. And they start to pass each other on the port sides. They were so close, it was that the Farragut could have stepped from the Hartford onto the top deck of the Tennessee. That's how close they are. They start to exchange broadsides. The Hartford has a broadside of solid 11-inch shot with 13 pounds of powder at a range of 8 feet without doing any damage. One shell from the Tennessee entered the Hartford's berth deck and exploded. Now, Captain Dryden reported the ships are so close that Captain Dryden thought he saw Buchanan on the Tennessee. And when he thought he saw him, he threw his binoculars at him, shouting at the same time, "You infernal traitor." Now, you had to put this in perspective. Percival Dryden is a native of South Carolina. So he's one of those Southern officers who stayed with the U.S. Navy. In fact, early in the war, at Port Royal, South Carolina, Percival Dryden on his ship fired on a Confederate fort commanded by his brother. So you can kind of imagine Percival Dryden's attitude towards Southern officers who left the service. But Buchanan, again, is going to be wounded by flying debris and suffered a compound fracture of his left leg. At that point, Commander James D. Johnston takes over command. The USS Ossipee, a wooden gunship, is getting ready to try to ram the Tennessee when the Tennessee surrenders at 10 a.m. By that time, her wheel chains have been disabled, the gun port shutters jammed, she couldn't generate enough steam to get underway, and all the gun primers had failed. So by that point, the Tennessee was really nothing more than a target ship for the Federal fleet. And that's why Johnson surrendered. Farragut is going to send Buchanan to the U.S. Naval Hospital at Pensacola for treatment. And Farragut wrote to Secretary Wills explaining his actions. And Farragut wrote, he, Buchanan, though a rebel and a traitor to the government that had raised and educated him, had always been considered one of its ablest officers, and no one knew him better or appreciated his capacity more highly than myself. And I may add, felt more proud in overcoming him in such a contest, if for no other reason than to prove to the world that ramming a helpless frigate at her anchor is a very different affair from ramming steamers when handled by officers of good capacity. So that's the dig at Buchanan for ramming 2 sailing ships as opposed to a fleet of steamers. Buchanan will finally be exchanged in February of 1863, but he doesn't get back to Richmond until March. And he's sent back down to Mobile, Alabama, to oversee the defenses there. But by the time he gets there, it's too late. Lee has surrendered at Appomattox, and the Confederates have evacuated Mobile City itself. His home, the rest, had been burned in 1864 by some sort of accident. Now, Talbot County, Maryland, never saw any heavy Union troop movements or anything like this. So it's not a case of Union retaliation. The house just burned because of an accident. They are going to rebuild the house after the war. But Buchanan has to find other things to do. And he eventually serves a short time as president of the Maryland Agricultural College, which is now University of Maryland, and secretary of the Life Association of America in Mobile, Alabama. He died of the rust on Maryland's eastern shore on May 11th, 1874. I tried to find monuments or statues to Franklin Buchanan. I couldn't find anything. The only thing I found was a medallion of him on a plaque at the Monitor and Merrimack Overlook in Newport News, Virginia. And that's it. That's the only image of Buchanan I could find. But he does have 3 U.S. naval ships named in his honor. The first USS Buchanan, DD-131, was commissioned in 1919, decommissioned in 1940, and turned over to the Royal Navy and renamed the HMS Campertown. She was used as a demolition ship during the raid on St. Nazarene in March 1942 and blown up. The second USS Buchanan, DD-484, was commissioned in 1942. She received a Presidential Unit Citation and 16 battle stars, one of the most decorated ships in World War II. She was decommissioned in 1946 and transferred to Turkey in 1949, finally scrapped in 1976. The last USS Buchanan, DDG-14, was commissioned in 1962. She saw service in the Vietnam War and was decommissioned in 1991. She was used as a target ship and finally scuttled on June 14th, 2000. The superintendent's home at Annapolis, which was built in 1909, is still known as the Buchanan House. That name so far has not changed. But in Franklin Buchanan's career, he went from wooden sailing ships to commanding steam-driven ironclads. He was a defender of tradition, a reformer, the first superintendent of the Naval Academy, first to charge a sword to take Fort Tuxpan, first American officer to set foot on Japanese soil, and the first American to con a U.S. man of war up the Yangtze River in China. He was a respected naval officer for over 40 years, and yet, as a Confederate naval officer for 4, tried to bring down the Navy that he had served. He never apologized for his actions and remained a conservative his whole life. And by conservative, I mean he's deeply in this Lloyd tradition. They never approved of Lincoln's emancipation. They did not like equality for African Americans or anything like that. So he was an old school Southerner in that respect. When the USS Buchanan, DDG-14, was christened in 1960, there was a huge American flag at the bow, and underneath that was a smaller Confederate flag right below it. The band, among other tunes, played Maryland, My Maryland, which was the song inspired partly by the events of April 19th. The principal speaker was Vice Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, Jr. Now, of course, the irony of all that is not lost on us today, but it does highlight the life of Franklin Buchanan, who spent 40 years in and loved the United States Navy, but who also spent 4 years fighting against it. I want to thank you folks for coming out this afternoon for the program. At this point, I usually ask if anybody has any questions. If someone doesn't want to stay around for the question and answer session, feel free to leave whenever you want to. We don't have magical chains coming out to lock you into the chairs. So feel free to go whenever you want to. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
On March 8th, the action was the worst loss until December 7, 1941.
Yes.
Did he also cause the flagship to be beached on that day? Besides
The USS Minnesota. Yeah, it didn't beach, it did run aground. And so because the Minnesota is the flagship of the North Atlantic Squadron, not just Hampton Roads, the Monitor, when it comes in, its orders are to protect the Minnesota. And that's what it does. So when it perceives that it chased the Virginia back towards Norfolk, the Monitor had done its job. And it went back closer to the Minnesota. So that's why you sometimes hear some criticism of the officers on the Monitor not chasing the Virginia and giving it more battle. But they essentially are following their orders. And the officers on the Monitor are never censored for not going after the Virginia. So they did exactly what they were told to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me a little about his relationship with his brother, Buchanan? Did they know they were on opposite sides in that fight? And why didn't McKeon join the Confederate Navy as his brother did? And are they the only siblings? Or can you tell me a little more about the brother?
I don't know much about the brother McKean Buchanan or why they didn't know how much, what their actual relationship was. McKean Buchanan doesn't become a paymaster until 1826, and he is the older of the brothers. But the only time they served together was in the Constitution in the Pacific. The only thing I know about McKean Buchanan, or McKean Buchanan, is he particularly prided himself on knowing the names of everybody on the ship he was serving on. He knew everybody in the crew and officers by name. So when the captain was doing an inspection and McKean Buchanan was with him, he could tell the captain who each one was as he's jotting down any corrections they need to make or things like that. Why McKean stayed in the Navy, in the U.S. Navy, and not go over, I'm not sure. But he continued, as I said, continued to serve as the paymaster until 1871. I don't know about the Navy itself, but certainly there's plenty of examples of brothers fighting on opposite sides. As I mentioned, Percival Dryden, U.S. Navy, at the Battle of Port Royal in South Carolina, commanded a ship that fired on a fort commanded by his brother. And Percival Dryden, if you read his letters, he has some very strong opinions about especially Navy officers who went south. As we mentioned with Farragut and most naval officers felt that they had represented the United States collectively more than Army officers. And when you think about it, that makes sense because it's the naval officers who are going all over the world, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, South America, the Far East, to show the flag. So they're representing the United States and not Maryland or Virginia or Pennsylvania. It's the United States they're representing. And so that's why they're staying, the majority of them stay with the colors, so to speak. Okay? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question about, he served on the CSS Virginia.
Yes.
But was he ever involved with her when she was the Merrimack? And how did he happen to be involved with the development and the design of the CSS?
Buchanan really has nothing to do with the design or the refit of the former Merrimack into the Virginia. He will have a hand in selecting officers for the ship, but he's not connected with the ship directly until he's named commander of the James River Squadron, with the Virginia as his flagship. So that's why he's on the ship on March 8th. It had been kind of a touchy thing at first because Captain Samuel Barron, who's in command at Norfolk, officially outranks Franklin Buchanan in both the U.S. and Confederate Navy. And so that's why Secretary Mallory established the James River Squadron, which takes Barron out of the chain of command. And so Buchanan now answers directly to the Secretary and no one else. But his job was to take the Virginia and try to break the Union blockade. That was the whole purpose behind the Virginia. Okay? Yes, sir.
Franklin had any descendants, and if so, did any of them have careers in the Navy?
None of them that I know of had careers in the Navy. His great-granddaughter helped to christen this third USS Buchanan, the one that had the little Confederate flag on during the christening. Yeah, that would never happen today. But that's why I say, looking back, we can see the irony of First of all, a ship being named after a Confederate naval officer, the rebel flag underneath the U.S. flag, the band playing Maryland, My Maryland, and Buchanan's great-granddaughter christening the ship. So 1960 was completely different than 2022. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So he lived about 9 more years after the Civil War ended, and he never apologized. And so what did he do for the last 9 years? Did he just retire and spend time with his family, or what did he do?
He was president of the Maryland Agricultural College, which is now the University of Maryland, and he served as secretary of, let me get it here. Secretary of the Life Association of America and Mobile, which was the insurance company. So he did have some jobs afterwards, but of course he's not going to enjoy the prestige he had before the war. He was considered one of the best naval officers in the service at the time he resigned. So who knows, if he had remained loyal, he might be the one attacking New Orleans instead of Farragut. You never know. Farragut, I think, was 55th on the list of captains when he was plucked by the Secretary of the Navy to command the New Orleans expedition. So Willis had to go down the list, eliminating one captain after another before he finally got to Farragut. And Farragut and him became captains the same year, 1855. But Cannons might be more senior. Anything else? Yes, sir. What?
How many guns did the Tennessee have its broadside capability? As you mentioned, they fired one shot, it hit into the heart. Did they not fire any other shots?
The Tennessee, if I remember, had 2 bow guns and maybe 2 guns on each side in broadside. She should have had 6 in broadside, but they only had 2. So, but like I said, all the shots coming in were bouncing off the sides, because it not only was ironclad, but he had several inches of pine and oak behind that as well. So the ironclad was just the coating. It's that wood that's going to be the best protection they have. There was one time with not when Buchanan was on, but on March 9th in the Virginia's fight with the Monitor. The Monitor got one lucky shot in that started to actually break the wooden planking behind the iron framework. And the speculation of she had gotten another second hit on that same spot, they would have penetrated into the hull of the ship. And that ironclad on the Virginia did not extend much past the waterline. So if the Monitor had been able to lower its guns enough, they might have actually hit the hull of the ship and sunk it that way. Of course, the big problem with the Monitor is its pilot house was up on the bow, just a little opening. And the Confederates had been able to throw a tarp over that. The ship was blinded. They wouldn't know where to go. That was one of the design flaws that they later corrected and moved the pilot house to the top of the turret. But, I mean, the thing is encased, so you can't get inside it unless you open the hatches. But you cover the pilot house with a piece of tarp, and nobody can see where they're going at that point.
Didn't they actually take a shot into the powerhouse?
The Virginia got a lucky shot close to the pilot house. It actually hit the pilot house. Dented some of the ironwork, and it actually exploded close enough that some of the powder got blown into the eyes of Lieutenant John Warden, who was commanding the Monitor. So he's knocked out of action. And by the time and it took several minutes to get word up to the turret to Lieutenant Green, who was the executive officer, that he was now in command. And so that allowed the Virginia to kind of break off a little bit and start to head back towards Norfolk at that point. Samuel Green, for those who might not know, was actually the son of General Green over here on Culp's Hill. That was the son. And Lieutenant Green, even though he's never censured for this or anything like that, there's never anything said about his courage or anything, the fact that he got in his head that he let the Virginia escape, and this always worked on his mind. And eventually, by 1875, I think it was, or around there, he was stationed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And one day went into one of the buildings and shot himself. Because he just could not get it out of his mind that he had committed an act of cowardice. But no one ever accused him of that. And he was properly promoted. He was an instructor of the Naval Academy. But he just could not get this thought out of his mind for some reason. So you can look at Lieutenant Commander Samuel Green as a casualty of the war. He's probably suffering from PTSD. Yeah. Anyone else? All right, I want to thank you folks for coming. And don't remember, there's 2 more talks next week. Thank you.